released footage of 50 fighter jets striking the underground compound of the Ayatollah.
2.2 million Iranians have been displaced by the conflict.
Iran's capital, Tehran, has been bombarded by Israeli forces as the conflict escalates on two fronts in the region.
Inside Iran, Israeli strikes continuing in what they've described as a new stage of the war. Iranian officials say more than 1,300 people have now been killed.
Iran had spent decades building what it called an impenetrable underground advantage. Hundreds of meters beneath mountain ranges, carved into bedrock across every province, a vast network of tunnels was constructed to store, assemble, and launch ballistic missiles from positions that no enemy aircraft could realistically reach. The IRGC called them missile cities, and for years that designation carried genuine strategic weight. Then the war began on February 28, 2026. And within days, the assumptions underpinning that entire architecture started to fracture. Satellite images taken in the opening days of the conflict showed the remains of several Iranian missiles and launchers destroyed in US and Israeli airstrikes near the entrances to what Iranian officials had long called missile cities. The facilities were not breached in the conventional sense. What happened was more surgical, and in many ways more revealing. The exits were turned into kill zones. US and Israeli fighter jets and armed drones began flying above dozens of the underground missile bases, striking launchers as soon as they emerged from tunnels to fire. The gates of Iran's underground arsenal had become the most dangerous place for its personnel to be. This is not simply a tactical story about how a particular batch of facilities was targeted. It is a story about a strategic miscalculation that unfolded over decades, a doctrine that was built on a certain understanding of modern warfare, and what happens when that understanding collides with technological and operational realities that no tunnel wall can stop. The personnel inside Iran's missile cities right now are not just facing logistical difficulties. According to current assessments, they are facing a fundamentally changed operating environment, one that raises serious questions about whether the underground model can continue to deliver the deterrence it was originally designed to provide. To understand why this moment matters so much, you need to understand what the missile cities were actually built to accomplish. According to Iranian authorities, underground missile bases exist across all provinces and cities of Iran. The bases contain road-mobile transporter launcher trucks, along with other hardware, and the missile program itself dates back to 1984, with the first underground base reportedly constructed that same year. That timeline matters. This was a long-term strategic investment, not a reactive measure. Iran's leadership concluded early that the country's conventional air force, which relied on aging aircraft and faced severe constraints from decades of sanctions, could not be the backbone of deterrence. Missiles could, and missiles buried deep underground, in hardened facilities dispersed across an entire country, would theoretically survive any first strike and guarantee a credible retaliatory capability. According to Talim Bar, a senior Israeli defense expert and head of the Space Research Center at the Fisher Institute for Air and Space Strategic Studies, these bases enable Iran to store and covertly fire surface-to-surface missiles. He described the underground facilities as a complex system of enormous tunnels that could be used for a surprise barrage missile attack. That description captures exactly what Iran intended these facilities to project: the threat of mass, coordinated launches from hardened positions that adversaries could not easily locate or neutralize. The IRGC's own commanders underscored this ambition in a March 2025 video that attracted significant international attention. IRGC Aerospace Force Commander Amir Ali Hajizadeh stated that if we have an unveiling of missile cities every week, it won't be finished for another 2 years, while Iranian Students News Agency referred to hundreds of underground missile bases of the IRGC Aerospace Force. That statement was framed as deterrence messaging. In retrospect, it may have also been an inadvertent advertisement of the very infrastructure that would shortly become a primary targeting objective. Analysts pointed out that Iran's drive to publicly signal its burgeoning underground network appeared motivated by the success of Israel in 2024 in striking above-ground targets across the country with relative ease. By burying, hardening, and dispersing its missiles, Tehran was attempting to take the military option off the table. The logic was sound on paper. The execution, however, contained a structural problem that only became visible under the pressure of sustained operations. The missile cities were designed around one core assumption, that the underground structure itself provided enough protection to guarantee survivability. What that assumption did not fully account for was the degree to which modern intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance technology had transformed the ability to monitor fixed infrastructure over time. According to analysts, the Pentagon and the IDF spent years mapping Iran's underground missile infrastructure before the current conflict began. That mapping effort was not simply about identifying entrances. It was about understanding the operating patterns of every facility, the predictable rhythms of when vehicles moved, when tunnel doors opened, when launch preparations took place. By the time the campaign launched, the targeting picture was already established. The critical vulnerability, as analysts began to describe it publicly within days of the conflict starting, was not the depth of the tunnels. It was the moment of exposure that any underground launch system requires. Sam Lair, a researcher at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, put it plainly. What used to be mobile and difficult to locate is now less mobile and easier to strike. A missile stored deep underground is protected. A missile being moved to a launcher, or a launcher emerging from a tunnel entrance to reach a firing position, is exposed for a window of time. That window became the primary point of targeting. Satellite images showed mobile launchers that appeared to have exited one underground site into a nearby canyon, but were destroyed before they could fire their missiles. The geometry of the problem is worth dwelling on. Iran's missile cities were built to guarantee that the weapons inside them would survive incoming strikes. They largely succeeded at that narrow objective. The tunnels were deep enough, the rock thick enough, and the dispersal wide enough that direct destruction of the stored arsenals required extremely specialized munitions that only the United States possessed in significant quantities. But survivability inside the tunnel did not solve the fundamental operational requirement. At some point, the missile has to come out. And the moment it does, without functioning air defenses overhead, under persistent surveillance from aircraft that now operated with effective air dominance over Iranian airspace, the launcher became a high-value target with a limited life expectancy. According to military reporting as of early March 2026, while many mobile surface launchers had been hit, Iran still retained a significant number of static or rail-based launchers inside its hardened underground facilities. These were much harder to destroy, but offered less flexibility than mobile units. Despite the loss of roughly half of Iran's mobile launcher fleet in just 3 days, its remaining units still represented a formidable threat. However, those losses were the primary reason why the massive 150 missile wave seen on February 28th had devolved into smaller, sporadic barrages of 9 to 30 missiles within days. That shift in barrage size is one of the most analytically significant data points of the entire campaign. Iran did not stop launching missiles because it had run out of them. According to current assessments, it still possessed a substantial stockpile. It reduced the scale of its barrages because the infrastructure required to execute large coordinated launches had been systematically degraded. The launchers, the command nodes, the staging areas between the tunnel exits and the firing positions, these were what had been destroyed. The missiles inside were intact, but the operational machinery required to deploy them at scale was under constant pressure. US CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper stated at a March 5th press conference that Iranian ballistic missile attacks had decreased by 90% since the war began, and drone attacks were down 83%. Those numbers reflected something the Missile City Doctrine had never been tested against before: a sustained, high-tempo interdiction campaign conducted with persistent air superiority, guided by years of accumulated intelligence, and supported by munitions specifically designed to threaten even hardened underground access points. Commercially available satellite imagery confirmed that the combined force struck underground facilities at the Esfahan missile complex in Esfahan province, with the strikes making it harder for military personnel to access underground missile silos. That specific detail, access being made harder rather than the silos themselves being destroyed, captures the actual mechanism of the pressure being applied. Personnel inside these facilities were not necessarily in immediate danger from direct impacts. They were increasingly operating in conditions where the tunnel systems that were supposed to guarantee their freedom of movement and operational readiness were instead becoming constraints. Ventilation systems, communication links, access corridors, and supply routes all depend on infrastructure that connects the underground environment to the surface. When that surface infrastructure is continuously monitored and repeatedly targeted, the underground becomes less a shelter and more an operational cage. New satellite images confirmed destruction at tunnel entrances at the Khorramabad missile complex, one of the facilities believed to house the largest number of missile silos in the country. Analysts reviewing satellite imagery identified signs of strikes or structural damage at underground missile facilities in multiple locations across Iran, including near Tabriz, Korgo, Haji Abad, and Jam. The geographic spread of those locations matters. This was not a campaign focused on one region or one facility type. The targeting pattern reflected the systematic use of a comprehensive intelligence map built over years, applied across the entire national network simultaneously. Israel's air campaign against Iran during the June 2025 12-day war had arguably marked the first instance of an air interdiction campaign successfully targeting enemy missile launchers at scale, a mission historically considered extremely difficult. That success appeared to be repeating itself in 2026, with dozens of videos published by US and Israeli official channels showing the destruction of Iranian mobile launchers. The Israeli Air Force stated that it alone had destroyed over 300 missile launchers since the beginning of the war. The scale of that figure, 300 launchers rendered inoperable by one Air Force alone within the first week, represents a level of operational attrition that the Missile City Doctrine was never designed to absorb. Part of what enabled this rate of destruction was a counterintuitive dynamic that defense analysts have begun to describe as the fixed infrastructure paradox. The decision to hide missiles in large underground bunkers appears to have inadvertently aided the targeting effort. When missiles and launchers are kept in dispersed mobile positions across open terrain, locating and tracking them requires constant surveillance over wide areas. When they are concentrated in known underground facilities, the intelligence challenge shifts from finding the assets to monitoring the access points. Every known entrance to a missile city became a permanent observation priority. Every vehicle movement near those entrances became a targeting signal. The very act of preparing a missile for launch, which requires bringing it to the surface and positioning it for firing, was now occurring within a surveillance environment of unprecedented density and persistence. The role of technology in enabling this surveillance environment deserves specific attention because it represents a qualitative change from how underground military infrastructure had previously been understood. Satellite imagery provided continuous visual monitoring of surface activity near facility entrances. With much of Iran's air defense network degraded, the United States and Israel were able to keep surveillance aircraft flying over known missile bases and strike quickly with fighter jets or armed drones when activity was detected. That combination, continuous overhead surveillance, made possible by the suppression of air defenses and rapid response strike assets already positioned and on patrol, created a targeting cycle that compressed the window between detection and engagement to the point where emerging from a tunnel entrance with a launcher had become an extremely high-risk operational decision. The psychological and organizational dimensions of this pressure are significant and often underappreciated in purely technical analysis. Personnel assigned to operate within these facilities are not simply facing a logistical problem, they are operating in an environment where the basic assumptions of their doctrine, that underground positioning guarantees survivability and operational freedom, have been visibly challenged. Iran's ballistic missile launches appeared more unevenly spaced, significantly smaller in scale, and less coordinated compared to earlier exchanges. This likely reflected effects on command and control that had complicated theater-wide coordination of missile operations. Iran appeared to be relying more on increasingly small units operating under pre-delegated authority to execute pre-authorized strike plans. That shift from centrally coordinated mass barrages to small unit pre-authorized launches under degraded command structures is a profound operational change. It suggests that the personnel inside these facilities were not simply experiencing logistical constraints, they were operating under conditions where the normal chain of command had been disrupted, where coordination across the network had become difficult, and where decisions that would normally be made at the theater level were being pushed down to local commanders with limited situational awareness. The Missile City network was designed to function as an integrated system. When the integration is disrupted, each facility becomes increasingly isolated, operating with whatever information and capability it had when the communication links last functioned. The question of whether these facilities could be restored to operational effectiveness during the conflict itself is important for understanding the trajectory of Iran's missile capability. Satellite imagery from February and March 2026 showed repairs to damaged missile sites near Shiraz and camouflage efforts at facilities like Talagan too, using soil burial and decoy sites to counter US and Israeli reconnaissance. Those repair efforts indicated that at least some facilities retained enough personnel and resources to attempt reconstruction. But reconstruction under active surveillance, with the same strike assets that damaged the facilities still operating overhead, creates a difficult operational dilemma. Every repair effort, every piece of heavy equipment moved to a tunnel entrance, every construction vehicle visible on satellite imagery represents a potential targeting signature. A former U.S. Marine Corps veteran with counterintelligence and special operations experience described what appeared to be a broader IRGC push to create defensive layers in anticipation of continued strikes, with engineering units working to secure ballistic missile sites as part of what he termed the regime's mosaic doctrine, in which IRGC ground and aerospace forces work to secure the physical infrastructure used to transport, store, and protect missiles. The fact that this kind of emergency hardening activity was still ongoing weeks into the conflict suggests that the initial protective measures were not sufficient. The doctrine required adaptation in real time, under operational pressure, against a surveillance environment that made adaptation itself a source of targeting intelligence. The strategic implications extend beyond the immediate operational context. The Missile City program represented a multi-decade investment in a specific theory of military power, that Iran could compensate for its conventional military disadvantages by building an asymmetric retaliatory capability so dispersed and hardened that no adversary could eliminate it before it was used. Defense analysts had described Tehran's approach as spending years hardening its program in underground storage tunnels, concealed bases, and protected launch sites across the country, creating a network that was supposed to make it harder to quickly degrade Iran's ability to launch. That assessment was accurate as a description of what the facilities were designed to do. What it did not capture was the degree to which the combination of persistent surveillance, degraded air defenses, and specialized munitions could transform hardened infrastructure from a protective asset into a constraint. According to Akhled's assessment, while Iran could continue retaliatory attacks, sustaining meaningful pressure on Israel over time would become increasingly challenging. If Tehran anticipated a prolonged confrontation and needed to preserve missile stockpiles for other potential fronts, it would likely be compelled to gradually reduce the scale and frequency of its launches. That analysis reflects a strategic position that the Missile City doctrine was explicitly designed to avoid. The entire purpose of the underground network was to ensure that Iran would never have to make a choice between expending missiles now and preserving them for later. The scale of the arsenal was supposed to make that trade-off unnecessary. Current developments suggest that the effective operational capacity, distinct from the raw inventory, has been constrained to the point where those trade-offs are now genuinely present. The Qashm Island dimension adds another layer of strategic complexity to this picture. According to retired Lebanese Brigadier General Hassan Jouni, a military and strategic expert, Qashm Island houses striking Iranian capabilities within what is described as an underground missile city. These vast networks are designed for one primary purpose: to effectively control or close the Strait of Hormuz. The naval dimension of the Missile City architecture connects the land-based ballistic missile threat to the maritime choke point that gives Iran its most significant economic leverage over the international community. If the operational pressure on the land-based missile infrastructure forces Iranian planners to consider preserving remaining capabilities, that calculus will necessarily involve decisions about how to prioritize the Strait of Hormuz threat relative to direct strikes on Israel and US bases in the Gulf. Iran launched a greater number of drones at Arab Gulf states than at Israel during the opening days of the conflict, likely due to their proximity to Iran. That geographic pattern reflects a realistic assessment of what remaining operational capacity could reliably execute. Long-range coordination against distant targets requires the kind of centralized command and control that has been degraded. Shorter-range systems against closer targets can be operated with more local autonomy. The shift in targeting patterns may reflect not just range calculations, but organizational capacity, what the system can still reliably do under its current operational constraints. What does this mean for the weeks ahead? Several specific indicators will determine whether the pressure on Iran's underground missile infrastructure continues to intensify, or whether Iran finds ways to adapt and reconstitute meaningful launch capacity. The first indicator is the rate of visible repair activity at damaged facilities. If satellite imagery shows sustained reconstruction efforts at multiple sites simultaneously, it suggests the IRGC has managed to redistribute engineering resources effectively. If repair activity is sporadic and limited to a small number of locations, it may indicate that personnel and logistics pipelines have been disrupted more extensively than official statements acknowledge. The second indicator is the pattern of any future missile launches. The shift from mass barrages to small sporadic salvos reflects current operational constraints. Any return to coordinated multi-site launches would suggest that command and control has been partially restored and that some tunnel exits are functioning with reduced surveillance pressure. Conversely, continued fragmentation of launch patterns would indicate that the organizational disruption has not been reversed. The third indicator involves the facilities that have not yet been prominently featured in publicly available damage assessments. Iran has missile bases in all provinces and cities throughout the country, with many at depths of 500 meters underground. The locations of many of these bases remain classified for security reasons. The deeper, more dispersed facilities that have not been publicly identified may represent the residual capability that neither side has yet fully assessed. Whether those facilities can be activated at operational scale, given the degraded command structure and the persistent surveillance environment, is the critical unknown that will shape the trajectory of this conflict. Despite significantly reduced launch capabilities, experts noted that Iran retained enough missiles to fire strategically and keep the region on edge. That assessment captures the essential tension of the current situation. The missile city network has not been neutralized. The strategic question it creates has not been resolved. What has changed is the operational context in which whatever remaining capability Iran possesses must be exercised. A context defined by continuous observation, rapid interdiction, degraded command networks, and personnel operating under conditions that the doctrine that built those tunnels never anticipated. The missile city concept was conceived as Iran's answer to conventional military inferiority. It was a sophisticated, long-term strategic investment that genuinely complicated the military calculus of any adversary. What current developments indicate, based on observable patterns of strike activity, satellite imagery, and the measurable decline in operational launch rates, is that the concept's practical effectiveness depends on conditions, functioning air defenses, intact command and control, unobserved tunnel access, and reliable logistics chains that can no longer be taken for granted. The tunnels remain, the missiles inside many of them remain, but the strategic environment above ground, from which those tunnels derive their operational meaning, has shifted in ways that the doctrine was not designed to accommodate. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.